Far removed from the bustling metropolitan centers of the Australian coast lies a vast and sweeping landscape defined by quiet agricultural communities. Among these is Snowtown, a modest settlement in the mid-north of South Australia. For generations, this town was known for its peaceful streets, its close-knit residents, and its reliance on the surrounding farming industry. It was a place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where the frantic pace of the modern world seemed comfortably distant. However, in the final year of the 20th century, this tranquility was shattered. Snowtown became the focal point of one of the most complex, extensive, and scientifically challenging criminal investigations in global history. This is not a story of a town's downfall, but rather a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice, the astonishing capabilities of modern forensic science, and the unwavering dedication of law enforcement to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. To understand the magnitude of the investigation, one must first look away from Snowtown and turn toward the northern suburbs of Adelaide during the 1990s. This era was marked by significant economic shifts. Industrial changes and economic downturns had left certain communities grappling with high unemployment and social challenges. In suburbs like Salisbury North, a segment of the population found themselves relying heavily on social welfare systems. Among these communities were individuals who were vulnerable, marginalized, and often isolated from extensive family networks. They were people dealing with various personal struggles, living transient lifestyles, and navigating the complexities of a society that frequently overlooked them. It was within this specific socio-economic environment that a highly organized and deeply deceptive criminal enterprise began to take shape. The architect of this enterprise was a man named John Bunting. To the outside observer, Bunting appeared entirely unremarkable. He did not possess the outward characteristics of a criminal mastermind. However, behavioral analysts and forensic psychologists would later identify him as a highly manipulative individual with an alarming capacity for coercive control. Bunting possessed a deep-seated prejudice against various minority groups and individuals he deemed undesirable. Rather than acting out in isolated incidents of aggression, he meticulously built a following. He identified and recruited individuals who were easily influenced, seeking belonging, or susceptible to manipulation. Among these associates were Robert Wagner, James Vlasakis, and Mark Hayden. The group dynamic that formed under Bunting's leadership is a textbook example of what psychologists refer to as shared psychotic disorder, or a localized environment of extreme coercive control. Bunting established himself as the absolute authority, dictating the group's moral compass and normalizing behaviors that were entirely detached from societal laws. He systematically desensitized his followers, drawing them into a collaborative web of deception and fatal actions. The primary motive, while initially masked by Bunting's ideological prejudices, was overwhelmingly financial. The group targeted vulnerable individuals, coerced them into relinquishing their banking details, identification documents, and welfare information, and then subjected them to fatal encounters. By assuming the identities of the deceased, the group could continuously collect their Social Security payments, creating a steady stream of illicit income. For years, the disappearances went largely unnoticed by the broader public. Because the victims were often estranged from their families or lived transient lifestyles, their absences were easily explained away. The perpetrators actively maintained the illusion that the victims were still alive. They moved the victims' vehicles, maintained their residences for a time, and most importantly, continued to withdraw funds from their bank accounts using automated teller machines. If a family member or acquaintance asked questions, Bunting and his associates would provide fabricated stories, claiming the individual had moved interstate for work or had simply decided to start a new life. This sophisticated layer of social deception allowed the criminal enterprise to operate undetected from 1992 until 1999, The unraveling of this extensive network did not begin with a dramatic confession, but rather with a standard missing persons report. In early 1999, Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden, vanished. Unlike previous victims, Elizabeth had ties that made her sudden disappearance highly suspicious. Law enforcement initiated a routine investigation, which quickly escalated when detectives began interviewing her husband. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his statements and unusual behavioral patterns. As detectives dug deeper into Mark Hayden's associations, the name John Bunting surfaced repeatedly. South Australian police launched a covert surveillance operation. Detectives meticulously monitored the movements, communications, and financial transactions of Bunting and his known associates. The investigation required immense patience and precision. Officers combed through mountains of financial records, tracing welfare payments issued to individuals who had not been seen in years. They discovered a chilling pattern. Social Security checks were being deposited into the accounts of missing persons, and shortly thereafter, the funds were withdrawn in cash from various automated teller machines across the region. The financial forensics applied in this case were groundbreaking for the time. Investigators had to subpoena records from multiple financial institutions, correlating transaction timestamps with security camera footage. In several instances, the grainy footage revealed members of Bunting's group using the bank cards of the missing individuals. Furthermore, investigators uncovered audio recordings. In order to keep the welfare accounts active, the perpetrators had actually recorded themselves impersonating the victims, using these tapes during telephone calls to social services to authorize continued payments. This audio evidence would later prove to be a devastating component of the prosecution's case, demonstrating a level of premeditation and callousness that shocked seasoned investigators. The surveillance operation eventually led detectives to a rented vehicle and a trail that pointed north, away from the Adelaide suburbs, directly toward the quiet agricultural center of Snowtown. The investigators focused their attention on an abandoned state bank building situated on the town's main street. The building had been rented out, supposedly to store agricultural supplies and everyday items. On May 20th, 1999, acting on a combination of financial evidence, surveillance data, and mounting suspicion, South Australian police secured a warrant and breached the abandoned bank. Entering the building, investigators were immediately struck by a harsh, overwhelming chemical odor. The source of the smell was located within the confines of the bank's old, reinforced vault. Inside, detectives discovered 6 large, heavy-duty plastic barrels. The contents of these barrels would launch one of the most intensive forensic recovery operations in Australian history. The barrels were filled with hydrochloric acid, and submerged within the corrosive liquid were human remains. The immediate priority for law enforcement was securing the scene while ensuring the safety of the recovery teams. Hydrochloric acid is highly volatile and poses severe risks of chemical burns and toxic inhalation. Hazardous materials units were dispatched to Snowtown. The extraction of the barrels had to be conducted with surgical precision. The vault was carefully ventilated, and the barrels were sealed, stabilized, and transported to a highly secure, specialized mortuary facility in Adelaide. Once the barrels were in the controlled environment of the mortuary, forensic pathologists and anthropologists faced an unprecedented challenge. The perpetrators had utilized the hydrochloric acid specifically to accelerate decomposition, destroy identifying features, and eliminate physical evidence. The chemical environment had severely degraded the remains, rendering traditional methods of visual identification and standard autopsy procedures nearly impossible. The scientific community had to innovate rapidly to give the victims their names back. The first major forensic triumph came through the field of odontology, or forensic dentistry. Human teeth are exceptionally resilient, protected by enamel, which is the hardest substance in the human body. Despite the corrosive nature of the acid, many dental structures remained intact. Forensic odontologists painstakingly cleaned and x-rayed the recovered mandibles and maxillae. These post-mortem x-rays were then meticulously compared against the pre-mortem dental records of the missing persons suspected to be victims. The unique patterns of fillings, extractions, root canals, and natural dental anomalies provided the first definitive identifications. It was a slow, agonizing process, requiring investigators to track down dental clinics across the state, hoping that paper records from years prior had not been discarded. While odontology provided crucial breakthroughs, it was not sufficient to identify all the victims or to build a comprehensive biological profile of the crime scene. Investigators turned to the rapidly advancing field of DNA profiling. In the late 1990s, DNA technology was transitioning from a novel, investigative tool to a foundational pillar of forensic science. However, extracting viable DNA from remains that had been subjected to prolonged chemical degradation pushed the boundaries of contemporary science. Forensic biologists utilized a technique known as polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. This technology allows scientists to take incredibly small, degraded fragments of DNA and amplify them, creating millions of copies until the sample is large enough to be analyzed. Scientists focused on extracting DNA from the deepest, most protected areas of the skeletal remains, such as the dense cortical bone of the femurs and the internal structures of the teeth. Once a viable genetic profile was amplified, it was compared against DNA samples willingly provided by the families of the missing persons. Through this monumental scientific effort, the laboratory confirmed the identities of the victims, providing undeniable scientific proof that linked the missing persons reports directly to the remains found in the Snowtown vault. In a surprising turn of events, the chemical concealment method chosen by the perpetrators inadvertently aided the investigators in another crucial area of forensic science. In some specific microenvironments within the barrels, the chemical mixture caused a process similar to saponification, where organic tissue transforms into a soap-like substance known as adipocere. This process, combined with the way certain materials were layered, paradoxically preserved small sections of dermal tissue. Forensic experts, utilizing advanced rehydration techniques and chemical enhancement, were able to recover partial fingerprints from the remains. These prints were run through national databases, providing secondary, irrefutable confirmation of identity. As the scientific community worked tirelessly in the laboratories, detectives continued to apply immense pressure on the suspects. The sheer weight of the circumstantial evidence, the financial records, the surveillance footage, and the emerging forensic data created an inescapable net. The turning point in the psychological battle between investigators and the suspects came through James Vlasakis. As the youngest member of the group, Vlasakis had been heavily manipulated and coerced by Bunting. Recognizing the overwhelming evidence against him and the reality of his situation, Vlasakis made the decision to cooperate with law enforcement. Vlasakis's cooperation provided investigators with a comprehensive roadmap of the criminal enterprise. He detailed the hierarchy of the group, the specific methods of manipulation used by Bunting, the timeline of the fatal encounters, and the locations of other crime scenes. His testimony corroborated the forensic findings and filled in the narrative gaps that physical evidence alone could not explain. Vlasakis guided police to an additional location, a residential property in Salisbury North, where further remains were recovered from the backyard, bringing the total number of victims associated with the group to 12. The subsequent legal proceedings would become the longest and most expensive in the history of South Australia. The trial was a logistical monolith. Because of the vast amount of evidence, the number of defendants, and the intense public interest, standard courtrooms were insufficient. A specialized courtroom had to be heavily modified to accommodate the thousands of physical exhibits, the extensive legal teams, and the complex audio-visual equipment required to present the forensic data to the jury. The prosecution's case was a masterclass in legal organization and forensic presentation. The state did not rely on a single piece of evidence, but rather constructed an interlocking web of facts. They presented the financial ledgers meticulously kept by Bunting, which coldly documented the victim's bank details and the welfare money collected. They played the audio recordings of the perpetrators impersonating the deceased. They brought forward the forensic odontologists, biologists, and anthropologists to explain, in clear and accessible language, how science had defeated the perpetrators' attempts at concealment. And crucially, they presented the testimony of James Vlasakis, who provided a chilling, first-hand account of the group's operations. The defense faced an insurmountable task. Their strategies largely revolved around attempting to undermine the credibility of Vlasakis, suggesting that he was minimizing his own role while exaggerating the involvement of the others. The defense teams also attempted to cast doubt on the forensic methodologies, arguing that the degraded nature of the evidence left room for reasonable doubt. However, the sheer volume and corroborative nature of the state's evidence proved too robust to dismantle. The jury was tasked with absorbing a staggering amount of complex information over a period of many months. They had to navigate the intricate details of financial fraud, the technicalities of DNA amplification, and the dark psychological dynamics of coercive control. After a grueling trial and extensive deliberations, the verdicts were delivered. John Bunting and Robert Wagner were found guilty of multiple counts of murder and were sentenced to consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Mark Hayden was convicted of assisting the offenders and received a lengthy prison sentence. James Vlasakis, in exchange for his vital cooperation and guilty pleas, received a life sentence with a non-parole period, reflecting both his culpability and his role in dismantling the criminal network. The legal conclusion of the Snowtown case brought a necessary sense of finality to the judicial process, but the echoes of the investigation resonated far beyond the courtroom. For the town of Snowtown, the aftermath was incredibly difficult. The community, entirely innocent and unaware of the tragedy hidden within their town limits, found themselves inextricably linked to a profound tragedy. Media from around the globe descended upon the quiet streets, casting a shadow over the town's identity. However, the resilience of the Snowtown community proved remarkable. The residents actively worked to reclaim their town's narrative. They focused on supporting one another, maintaining their agricultural heritage, and demonstrating that the actions of outsiders would not define their home. A quiet, respectful memorial was eventually established, ensuring that the victims were remembered not for the circumstances of their discovery, but as individuals who deserved dignity and respect. The legacy of the victims remains the most vital aspect of this case. Clinton Trezise, Ray Davies, Suzanne Allen, Michael Gardner, Barry Lane, Thomas Trevelyan, Gavin Porter, Troy Yude, Fred Brooks, Gary O'Dwyer, Elizabeth Hayden, and David Johnson. They were sons, brothers, friends, and community members. The investigation served to highlight the vulnerabilities within social support systems and prompted significant reviews of how welfare agencies track individuals and verify identities. The systemic loopholes that allowed the perpetrators to exploit the financial identities of the missing for years were subsequently closed, leading to stricter oversight and more robust communication between social services and law enforcement agencies. Furthermore, the case stands as a landmark in the history of forensic science. The methodologies developed and refined during the investigation of the remains set new precedents for how law enforcement handles heavily degraded evidence. The successful extraction of DNA from such a compromised chemical environment proved that no matter how far perpetrators go to destroy evidence, the relentless advancement of science will continually narrow the gap between concealment and discovery. The dedication of the forensic teams established protocols that are now utilized in complex recovery operations worldwide, from disaster victim identification to historical missing persons cases. The Snowtown investigation is a profound study in the duality of human capability. It exposes the depths of manipulation and deception that individuals can orchestrate for financial gain and control. Yet, more importantly, it highlights the extraordinary lengths to which society will go to uncover the truth. The thousands of hours logged by detectives tracing financial records, the meticulous care taken by scientists amplifying microscopic fragments of DNA, and the unwavering commitment of the legal system all serve as a powerful counterweight to the actions of the perpetrators. As we reflect on the immense scale of the investigation, the technological triumphs that broke the case wide open, and the enduring resilience of the affected communities, we are left to consider the broader implications of community vigilance. The perpetrators relied on the isolation of their victims and the anonymity of modern bureaucracy to sustain their enterprise. In an increasingly connected yet deeply private world, how do we ensure that the most vulnerable among us do not simply slip through the cracks? And what steps can we take, in our own communities, to guarantee that everyone remains seen, valued, and protected?